Please be seated. Happy second Sunday of Lent, my friends. And welcome, Corey. It's a delight to have you here. The gospel this morning is a gospel about life. It is not a gospel about death. And if we hope to catch a glimpse of what it may mean for us, we must begin with this insight. Jesus is not interested in suffering, rejection, and death for the sake of suffering, rejection, and death. Jesus is vibrantly alive. And this gospel is about what it means as a human being to be vibrantly alive in God. Contextually, right? So let's set the context a bit here. It was interesting, Barbara and I were talking yesterday about today's gospel, and I was astonished because she remembered what I said last year about this gospel, and then proceeded to let me know that I ought not to say the same thing again. But, at least to set some context, Jesus has been in Mark's story for the flow of the narrative, engaged in a progressively more heated exchanges and tension with his antagonists within the hierarchy of existing Jewish life and practice, to put it that way. At some point, Jesus makes the decision to leave Galilee, which he does. He leaves Galilee and he goes to to Tyre and Sidon, in Phoenicia, near the Mediterranean. He leaves the Jewish world, Jewish territory, and goes into a Gentile world. This is where has the exchange with the Syrophoenician woman. Then Jesus makes a loop. He doesn't go back to Galilee, apparently. He makes a loop around to the north and ends up in Caesarea Philippi, way to the north, right on the edge of what would be considered territory of Jewish life and practice. And it is when he's far to the north, about 80 or 90 miles north of Jerusalem, that we have the context for the gospel today. Now, it's interesting, Epiphany always ends with the gospel of the Transfiguration, right? So the last Sunday of Epiphany was the gospel of Jesus on the Mount and transfigured. The gospel today is what immediately precedes the Transfiguration. So we have to sort of get our pieces together here, right? So we get a sense of the flow of Mark's story. Immediately preceding the gospel that we read this morning, Jesus, far away now, knowing that he is about to turn to go to Jerusalem, says to his closest followers, "Who do you think I am? Or who do people say that I am?" And they give him some answers, John the Baptist, the prophet, etc. Then Jesus asks them directly, "But who do you say that I am?" Now remember what they've seen up to this point. These people have been journeying with Jesus now, and they have seen some astonishing things. They have seen him free people from spiritual oppression by simply speaking a word. They have seen him, at least some of them, raise a little girl from the dead. They have seen him heal countless persons of their illnesses. They have been with him when he did something nobody could explain, taking 5 loaves and some fishes and feeding 5,000 people. Not once, but twice. They have seen him, at least they think that they've seen him, walking on the top of the Sea of Galilee in the midst of a storm. They have seen him and listened to him say things like, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, speaking of himself when he was challenged about Sabbath breaking. They have seen him intentionally cross lines that scandalized his Jewish religious contemporaries. They have seen some pretty astonishing and powerful and sometimes frightening things. And I think it helps us to imagine, at least it helps me to imagine Jesus. And this is how I imagine Jesus. Alive and vibrant and joyous and moving, constantly moving. Constantly engaged in what he understands to be God's purpose for him. And now he has asked them a question, and Peter responds, "You are Messiah." Now, you could draw that conclusion. And then Jesus says to Peter, immediately before our gospel this morning begins, Jesus says, "And don't tell anyone." Why? Well, we're going to find out why in a moment. Now, Mark shifts. By the way, this is the great pivot in Mark's gospel. The great pivot in Mark's gospel happens in this text. Because this is the beginning of the journey to Jerusalem. Jesus, Mark says, began to say plainly, in plain language, what awaited him in Jerusalem. Now, I don't happen to subscribe to the magical Jesus who knows everything about everything. No, I think Jesus had come to this deep insight into what he was being called to do by a combination of his experience, of his ability to observe what was happening, and by his sense of identification with a stream of Jewish spirituality which has become known as the suffering servant of Isaiah. Jesus begins to teach them, I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to suffer terribly. I'm going to be killed. And I'm going to rise on the third day. Now, Peter, who had just confessed Jesus as Messiah, Mark says, takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him. Very strong word. It's the same word that Mark uses when he describes Jesus rebuking the evil spirits. Pretty strong word. Peter, if I may be allowed to conjecture, was scandalized by what Jesus had just said. This was not the destiny of Messiah. And by engaging in this rebuking of Jesus, Peter was exhibiting exactly what Jesus was trying to avoid and why he told his disciples not to tell anybody he was the Messiah, because there was a vision of who Messiah would be, and Jesus wasn't it. The vision of Messiah as conquering, sovereign, sent by God to restore the order of the world, to fulfill God's promises and free Israel from tyranny and domination, to punish the wicked and reward the righteous. This was the image we can surmise that Peter had of Messiah. And why shouldn't he? Because that was one of the dominant images of Messiah that Peter lived with. But Jesus had a different understanding of what it meant to be Messiah, the Anointed One. Jesus could hold two things that seemed mutually exclusive. Remember back to last week's gospel? What did the voice from heaven say that Jesus heard? You are my beloved. In you I am well pleased. Jesus could hold that as being true, and that the Messiah must suffer. Jesus then rebukes Peter. Again, same word, very strong. Calls Peter Satan. Because Peter at that moment represents the very thing that Jesus is struggling against. This triumphalistic idea that to do the purposes of God in the world means you always win. We human beings generally, I think, would be much more comfortable with a God who wasn't so vulnerable, who always wins. Wouldn't we like that? Wouldn't things be so much simpler if the bad people were punished and the good people were rewarded? Jesus understands something, if I can articulate it like this. God will not save us from the consequences of our faithfulness to God. Think about that for a moment. When Oscar Romero was shot in the heart, celebrating Eucharist at the altar, he was killed as a consequence of his faithful witness to the gospel. God did not save Oscar Romero from the consequences of his faithfulness. God did not save Martin Luther King from the consequences of his faithfulness. Jesus does not believe that God is going to save him from the consequences of his faithfulness to what he understands to be God's purpose for him. Now go back to what Jesus said would happen. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to die. But that isn't where it ends. What did Jesus say would happen next? I will rise again in 3 days. And this now, we see two things. We see the vulnerability of Jesus, which he fully accepts. And we see the hope of Jesus. We see what is deeply, deeply, deeply pervading